the differentiation between introversion and extroversion and how we process input. What we do know is there exist, well, it does not really necessarily exist tangibly, but we could define a spectrum or a line segment where we have extroversion on one side of the extreme and introversion. And we notice that we have this is based on preference. Someone would be preferred to, be an introvert, or someone may, depending on situation. So you could exist right here, and then over time, you could tend toward the neutral axis, maybe end up somewhere over here. Or you could start here, and you can shift in this direction over here. Depending on the situation, of course, it's you could think of it like this: like if our ancestors if our ancestors existed at such position, the probability, or let's say the density, because you can't just take one ancestor, but most of them were within this range, or within a range. Let's suppose the range is, you could just say a range from here to here, even though this doesn't really exist, as it's more of an abstract representation. But if they exist within this range, the probability of you yourself existing somewhere along here would likely be higher, but the variability, there's the thing is with genetics and the permutations is you take on, although it's a representation of ancestry, we don't know exactly the permutation or the combinations of these traits, and such combination can obviously change this, and ultimately you can end up as an introvert. But a lot of it's also environment. So the genetics kind of dictate probability of being in a position, but the environment changes that over time. Depending on the situation, it really reinforces certain traits. But it's interesting how there's ways to channel information, how to channel your energy, and that has to do with processing. So if you normally, if you have an event frame, this could be an event frame, and you're some position right here. Well, this is a subset of the real, a subset of reality, essentially. So you have to take an input radially, or depending on your range of perception. So our range of perception is always going to be, conical, just like the eye. So the range of perception has the limit or the boundary. This is boundary 1 to boundary 2. So basically within this such boundary or limit exists our limit or perception. So whatever is fed inward it's not going to be instantaneous. So what I mean by that is if you take the time axis, so this is time 0 on let's suppose the input's always being fed in, but we're just going to take one frame. We're going to zoom in. This is really, let's suppose really fast. And what we know is when we zoom in, there's going to be some hiatus. This is basically the input's coming in, it enters, let's say the input enters, this is the initial point, it's an input, this is entry, and then this is the time that it takes for the brain to actually assimilate and somehow make sense of that information. It's not completely instantaneous. It almost works like frames. So if you take, how would I draw this? This is, well, essentially we're going to have three-dimensional space. So this is 3-dimensional space, and this, extends. And then we're gonna extend this frame in segments, but essentially, if you zoom in, there's going to be incremental small gaps. It's like these frames are happening, so the rate is so fast. Time flow seems instantaneous. Or this is like time flow or the perception. So, of course, it's like it's interesting how but in terms of processing, there's two pathways typically. So generally, there's always going to be if you think of like our world now, like this is a set of like let's just say this is all current information. So it's external. So we can find these information at any points. Like you have X, Y, Z, you're in a position, you can find information, but these are, let's just say this is, it could be books, it could be factual information, academics, we're learning a lot. So what ends up happening is we have a process of divergence and convergence. So typically, what ends up happening is information. So if you start at this point, information could come in. Let's just say this is this type of information. It's flowing in inward. And this is just external input. And then once you increase the depth, let's just say you're increasing this is like you have no information, and then you're gathering more and more information. So you're increasing the depth range. And what generally happens with a lot of cases is this information is channeled towards a point. And a lot of times this point could be a goal. A lot of times, it tends to be a goal or a solution. Answer, insights. These are the sets. So what ends up happening is there is a limit. When you gather information, you plot this on a function. This is, we could call, even though this doesn't really exist, like we relate this to info density. So basically, you're compiling, think of info density as bits divided by range. So even though this terminology, but just think about like you're gathering information, and depending on the range or the volume of space, like this like volume of space, or you could just say observables or whatnot, and bits of information. Anytime you have like a set, there's bits of information that you collect. And the more bits of information, the higher the probability of reaching a solution. So the key is like when info density is high, the time. So when info density is high, very high, it doesn't take a lot of time. Kind of goes like this. Something like a decay function. If you have lowered, it takes, the time range is longer to get to that solution. So this is solution. Same solution. But if there's a low, so basically this is kind of like showing like this. As info density increases, It takes less time to get to the solution. But another thing that we should talk about is relevancy. So suppose we have a set of elements. This is all you need to get to a solution or goal or whatnot, ... Now, if you end up collecting data points outside, it would make sense that as you tend towards irrelevancy, as you're going outside of this, and you're not trying to connect it somehow into this set, and you just kind of going towards chaos, you just come up with random thoughts, ideas popping up randomly, the probability of reaching a solution is much lower. It's going to take more time. So of course that also relates to this info density, where the density has to do a lot with the relevant information, the information within here. And that's typically, at least what I've noticed is in academics, a lot of times academics is a convergent system. Predominantly. So there's subjects like philosophy, mathematics, and deep is more open-ended approach. But when you get into engineering, a lot of the applied courses, you're gonna find, you need, if you want to achieve a good grade, you want to abide by the system, learn only what is relevant to converge and get a higher grade as fast as possible. And that's a lot of times what's happening. We're, gathering the information that was needed, and we get solution 1, we gather information as needed, we get solution 2, or understand, it doesn't have to be necessary, we gather information, we understand solution 3, and you continue this iterative process, and then you have grade. So of course grade, if you're daydreaming, so if you're out going in outer space and you're not collecting any of these points, well, then the grade is going to be floored. So we can just say degree of relevancy. Degree of relevancy, and or I would just put it this way. Let's just put grade, or screwed up there. Degree of relevancy, and this would be grade. So, of course, when there's a high degree of relevancy, it should shoot up. So it's something like, or shoot up like this. I didn't draw it perfectly. We don't know the exact function, but there should, ideally, if you have more relevancy, you should have a higher probability of reaching a higher grade. So this is a typical mode, and a lot of people are very goal orientated or successful in academics. This is the pathway that is generally taken, but there's another pathway where you start at a point and you think of random ideas out here. So it's still divergence. So, you're collecting these random ideas. And then once it's channeled and you have more growth, there's always going to be the convergent process too. Convergence is, this is like thinking like you make, another process is like you understanding. You could think of depth, so forth, like when you're going deep into the, trying to make sense of everything. And it may not necessarily be tied to reality. So even though these may have been like irrelevant towards, like, let's say a goal or anything. They may just be ideas, like you're thinking of writing a book. It may not even be practical. But the key is these ideas do not necessarily exist either. So that's the biggest thing, is they either exist tangibly or they do not exist tangibly. They're intangible, but they're still external sources. And either way, depending on the pathway, it ultimately must converge somewhere. But the degree of divergence, we could think of it this way: if the frequency of divergence increases, the likelihood of convergence decreases. So the frequency is like you go here, and let's say you have a point, you have 1 point. And this is, let's just say the time axis. This is from 0 to time t equals a. And all these relations have to deal with this. So now let's say we have 2 points. But now when you connect 2 points, they may be connected. You may find an interrelation between those. So now we could find, 3 points. So you connect this point, you connect this point, you connect this point, and now you can find a relation here. You may find a relation between here, but you also may find a relation between here, and so forth. So now there's 4. So there's we just did n plus 1. And essentially, you continue this process, and notice how if the frequency increases, it just gets scattered and scattered. So basically, we're tending towards chaos. Tending towards chaos. And anytime there's chaos, we can't organize. Chaos destroys organization. So like when we have when Earth was created, we had scattering of elements. But the elements had forces. There's affinity to denser conglomerates. So basically, this has a higher probability of, depending on the distance of going this way. Of course, this should be any they're following. So eventually, they're converging, and they're developing density. So eventually, the planets grew and grew, and essentially, it went from this chaotic region to organized matter. But there was some organization within here. There's forces, there's, so forth. And our mind has that ability, but there is a limit. There is a limitation, like always. When it gets too chaotic, we're tending towards, it becomes disorganized. We can't organize anymore, and now it goes towards incoherency. So that's the key here, is, there's different pathways of processing information, but ultimately, to me, it's the biggest thing. This is all depends on reward feedback. So, like, if someone is extroverted, so we mentioned the extroversion, introversion spectrum. So someone is extroverted, you can assume they like being around a crowd, more likely, or they like external sources, like playing video games. Something needs to be external. So an extrovert tends to go outward initially. This is like initial condition. So initial condition, and an introvert would rather, that's the key word, would rather go inward. And then we develop a reward. So reward So if we suppose this changes, so they change, they switch slots. So typically an extrovert over time, you know, in this type of instance, say this is like we're talking about so that this you're typically going to go somewhere up, you know. I don't know the exact function, but if an extrovert became an introvert and it was during a period that was unpreferred, because obviously you can always switch and it depends on preference. If it was an unpreferred period, you know, there may be something like, you know, this, and then eventually it crashes. Because like you reach a limit, time limit, where you spend too much time around people and you rather go inwardly. Or in this case, you wanted to be around people, but you had to, in this case, let's say you translate into a closed environment, there's no one. You're secluded totally from people. Well, of course, there's that limit, and then its reward collapses. So same situation with the introversion converting to an extrovert. You eventually get tired of being around people, and it collapses. So really, a lot of this boils down to reward feedback. But it's always evolving. So this is depending on the case and the situation. What I mean by that is an introvert may want to revert to an extrovert in certain periods, or extroversion, because we all process externally and we have to process internally. The thing about this is if you were only to go inwardly all the time, suppose you live in your imaginary world. So this is like imaginary. And this is real. So imaginary world, basically the bits, how would I put it? It's so if you spend a lot of time in this region, so you have a bunch of elements that you collect in here. Say it's very, you know, very rich, and you only have like a few. You have very few elements. So you're basically or inputs. So you only you very infrequently convert from your imaginary world to the real world. So what ends up happening is if you do a function, this is ability to organize bits. So these are bits of information or bits of ideas or bits of anything. And the ability to organize over time, of course, if this is the imaginary plane, so this is like a imaginary case. So of course, it's, you know, say like start zero, like you start initially, you start time to equal 0, no ability, and then, you know, over time, slowly increases, depending on the rate. It depends on your ability to organize your internal world. But then you have real case, so real world case. So essentially the same axis. Well, suppose like time, let's suppose in the beginning, you spent a lot of time in the real world, and then eventually you just reverted to the imaginary plane, and you spent all let's just say you have a time axis. Let's just say this revert to imaginary plane. Just say I am is imaginary plane of existence. So this is like T, you know, it could be A, and then let's say this is like the beginning, like T, you're born, and you and if you suppose you never had like an imagination, which is really unlikely. We're just doing this for an example. So this range is like you're collecting bits in the imaginary plane and you collect no bits in the real plane. So this is real. And you collect no bits in the imaginary plane. Well, it's going to start high because you adapted, and then it's going to decay. So there could be a limit where this limit right here, L, L represents chaos. So initially when we're adapting to any environment, we're organizing bits of information. So then the next time, so we go to like one event time frame. This is event 1. And we're basically collecting bits, but we're connecting the bits together. So then we translate to another event that's distinct. So we collect this bit, but we find a relation to a previous input. And we collect this bit and we find this relation, and therefore the adaptation process is fueled. So it's always proportional to, you need time to collect. So therefore, if you situate yourself at a point of existence, if I were to situate myself in this plane of, or what's to say, this position right here, and I stay here my entire life, my field of reference is so limited. So when I transfer into a new event that's so distinct, there's going to be a distinction. So let's suppose this is this event. Of course, I'm collecting a lot because I just have to be in one, so it's increasing in density. But then I translate to a new event, and this is like the distinction. The distance. Let's say the distance is very large. And I collect bit. Well, it may induce anxiety. This may be like, this could induce anxiety, because the probability will be much higher if you can't relate it. It's so distinct, and you spent so much time just in one event that you didn't have enough information to relate to here. And therefore, if it's too much overload, like this could be like chaotic, essentially, because now the bits are so scattered and there's not many connections or bridges. When there's not many connections, not much organization, probability of anxiety increases. So yeah, this is just to show, like, this video, just how we process information and how like adaptation works. It's kind of just my viewpoint, but yeah, I'm gonna stop right here. This is random musings, so I kind of just go on tangent, or let's share my random ideas. And of course, I've always mentioned, when I have an interview or when I have a presentation, it will be different every single time. I've never been one to try like memorizing things. I like interpreting it, different ways, and I let my mind do so. And that's why, my mind can be slightly chaotic at times, just because I've allowed it to do so. I've adapted to that mode of lifestyle. So really, what it boils down to is how you live your life, how you where you situate yourself, all the events you situate yourself. It affects every facet of life, the mind, your health, everything. So yeah, that's just I'm gonna stop right here, and hope you enjoyed.